I've been having a ton of conversations with family, friends, and my clients about grief. Grief is one of the most complex human emotions, and everyone experiences it, but no one knows what it really is. I got time before my next client gets here, so let's talk about it.
Welcome to In Session, the podcast focused on making therapy feel more human and more accessible. This is Between Sessions, a short segment where Associate Licensed Marriage and Family Therapist Mark Ponce highlights themes and questions that might help you think differently about your therapy and life experiences. Thank you for being here. Please enjoy today's episode.
Welcome to Between Sessions, where I highlight themes and questions that might help you think differently about your life experience or some themes that you might be highlighting in your own therapy. The fun part of this segment is I try to answer these questions in just 10 minutes, which is about the amount of time I really get between sessions. So just a reminder, this podcast is, of course, for educational and reflective purposes only. It's not a substitute for therapy. So if something resonates with you here today or in other episodes, consider bringing it into your own sessions and reaching out to a licensed professional like myself or the wonderful therapists that I highlight. So let's talk about grief. We're already a minute in. I got my timer going, and we probably need way more time than just 10 minutes to discuss this complex topic. I think the important thing to note is that grief doesn't have one specific way of displaying itself. It is often very unique to the person who's grieving. Some folks grieving one way and others grieving another, and all is very normal. One's own experience of grief is so heavy that it's only appropriate they process that, how it works for them. Examples of just the differences of grief across people, can occur cross-culturally, generationally, or geographically even. You look at parts of Latin America and Africa where their grief processing is often more collective and celebratory. You see a lot more open expression of grief through celebration like Dia de los Muertos or multi-day funerals that include lots of lively music and dancing, really just celebrating the life of the lost loved one. Then you see a more spiritual and ancestral focused grief in parts of Asia and some indigenous cultures, often more community oriented, where they have communal mourning periods that really emphasize the spirit, continuity, and carry a lot of respect for the loved one in that way. Then in many Western and East Asian traditions, you have a more structured and stoic grief. Think funerals that are displayed in movies or funerals that you've been to, where it's more about individual reflection and time to process by oneself. Grief is processed in many different ways, and it's important that we show compassion to all the different ways we or our peers or our loved ones process that grief. In the introduction to this episode, if you remember, I called grief one of the most complex human emotions. And instead of editing that out, I thought perhaps the better word, though, to use is when describing grief is experience or process. Because if you couldn't tell already, grief is so much more than one emotion. It brings out a ton of emotions, and often these all happen all at once. So it just can feel like a jumbled mess inside. Grief also isn't attributed to the loss of a loved one. Of course, that's where it shows up a lot. But I've seen grief in my work with clients or even in my own life in instances where life takes some level of transition. And what someone was used to in their life and familiar with suddenly changes, leaving an impact on that person. This could be a loss of a job, there's grief there. Graduating from college, which was a big point of grief in my own personal life because I lost structure and familiarity and some built-in friends. And of course, grief lives in losing one's own possessions to natural disaster. All of these examples is grief. And no one instance of grief grieves heavier than another because the weight of that grief people feel often is the same. Another part of grief that I really want you to know is that it's not uncommon for a person to think that grief's process is linear, meaning from point A to B. I think often it's just part of the human brain or part of how society depicts health that when we suffer, suffering has an end point. And at that end point, suffering just ceases to exist. With grief and many other emotions, really, complexity succeeds because rather than emotions and grief being linear, it's often circular, and that's normal. It's confusing because in modern day research on grief, it's characterized it in steps and stages. You have your denial stage, bargaining, anger, depression, acceptance. So it's only right that we think once we hit acceptance, we've succeeded in the processing of grief. Now, this could absolutely be the case for some folks, and if that's you, amazing, congratulations. But for most, grief happens in a circle. We move through these different stages dynamically, where we start at the first, and then we move to the next, and then we go back to the stage before then, and then move to the last, and then go back to the first when something activating happens, and that's normal and can feel heavy and confusing for the person experiencing that grief because they think to themselves, wait, I've thought I've already processed through and accepted this. Why am I all of a sudden depressed again or angry again? And once we can understand that grief is a circle rather than a straight line, then the process is less jarring and opens our ability to communicate our experience with other people and heal through it once again. With all of this, it might be worth asking yourself, where in your life has there been instances of grief? Has grief only been in moments where you lost someone close to you, a family member, a pet, a friend? Or does grief exist in other life transitions? As you move from job to job, or you graduated college, it might be worth sitting down, journaling about this and reflecting on it. That way your body's not holding on to unprocessed grief that you might not even be aware of. Something I truly believe about grief is that it's extra love that we have in our hearts that is displaced. And when love is displaced, it can fester on the inside because it needs a place to go. So when we lose something or our life transitions, we need to find a way to take that love that we had for that person or that instance and put it into something that can hold that amount of weight. If you want to learn more about the processing of grief or get a different perspective on grief, this is something I explore more in my episode with Amisha Gandhi, where we discuss grief in regards to relationships and identity, or even my episode with Kelly Herzberg, where we talk about life transitions and reauthoring our experiences. There are many different ways of thinking about grief, and of course, my perspective is only one of them. So please, talk about grief with those important to you and see what they think. And I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on grief. You can send me an email or DM me on Instagram or leave a comment below the post regarding this episode. And of course, if this episode resonated with you, please consider following the show. Send me some of your feedback. This is my first solo episode, so I'm all ears to figure out how I can make this better and right for you. And if you know someone in your life who's grieving right now, go ahead and give this episode a share. Maybe it'll help them see their experience a little clearer. Thank you for being here today. I gotta get to my next session. So until next time, my friend.
Thanks for listening to this episode of In Session. If something resonated with you, let us know on any of our socials or directly on the podcast episode. If you want to be featured on the show, please DM us or reach out to our team at insessionpod@outlook.com. That's insessionpod@outlook.com. Please like and follow, and we'll see you on the next episode.